Disclaimer. The views expressed in this video, as well as the content and images, are for review purposes only. If you are interested in what we are reviewing, please pick up a book and form your own opinions. What I like and dislike, others may not like or dislike. Reading is a very individual thing. If you do pick up the book, please leave a review, as this not only helps out authors financially, but is essential to helping us improve our skills. Furthermore, if you'd like to support me and my channel, you can follow the links down in the descriptions to my own works and my own books. And you can also help out by liking or commenting below and subscribing to the channel. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This week we are reviewing The Name of the Wind. And I'm going to preface this review by saying this one's going to be done a little bit differently, because this book is a little bit different. So this time I'm going to give you my recap, and the likes and dislikes afterwards will be mingled. And I'll explain why when we get there. So let's begin with the story recap. So our story begins in this little inn called the Waystone Inn in the middle of this town that might house a dozen or 24 people. We have our bartender Coat, or his real name Quoth, is basically watching an old man tell a group of young boys a story about a demon called Chandrian, which makes blue fire appear when it shows up and a whole bunch of other things we're not going to get into here. The story's just getting exciting when a local boy arrives, and I say boy as in about a teenage boy, maybe 15, 16 years old, and he appears to have been attacked. And whatever attacked him killed his horse, but lucky for the boy, the horse fell on whatever was attacking it, nearly killing it, allowing him to basically stomp it to death, which was a suitable reaction because he's carrying this thing in his arms, and it turns out to be a type of spider demon. Now, everyone in the inn is collectively freaked out. Somebody just walked in with a giant spider demon that, well, giant, it's about the size of a wagon wheel that has no eyes and no visible mouth. They decide it's time to give it a test to see if it's actually a demon, in which one of them pulls out an iron penny, touches it to the demon, and this causes it to immediately start to crackle and burn. A little bit freaky, but there you go. Quoth sews the boy up, and after a conversation with his apprentice Bast, informs him that the locals did indeed dispose of the creature as they should have, burning it with the right woods, making sure it was nice and hot and long, and then burying it in the proper sized hole. Apparently there is a lot of process to dealing with demons in this world. He has a brief conversation with his apprentice about the local girls and about his apprentice's studies, and promptly dismisses him so that he can have some time to himself. We then cut over to a man named Chronicler. We do eventually learn his name, but for the book's sake he's just referred to as Chronicler. We meet him as he's getting robbed by former military. And by robbed, I mean they took out all of his stuff and they're trading the worst of what they have for the best of what he has. So he's leaving with basically the same stuff, just a worse version of it. Except for his horse. They keep his horse and all of his money. Apparently it was a very gentle robbing, at least according to Chronicler, who's been robbed several times, and as such has several different hiding spots for money that they didn't check, as well as using some psychological things to make sure they didn't give him the old pat down to get any money he might have hidden in his shoe or by his crotch, which is where he was hiding his money. We cut back to town and a tinker has arrived, and a tinker is kind of a mix between a merchant and a guy who fixes things. I've only recently become aware of this fantasy term, and so far I have seen it in 2 different books, so I'm not sure how common it is. Anyway, this brings a lot of people to town, and so Quoth's Inn becomes a much more lively place. And everybody in the inn is drinking and having fun and enjoying themselves, when unfortunately someone identifies Quoth. The man is obscenely drunk, and Quoth gets his apprentice to basically knock the man out with some drugs, basically slipping him the mickey so he can't ask too many questions. If you had any illusions about this being a family-friendly story, you can end them right there. They come up with a cover story about Quoth having learned from a battlefield medic, I believe, as how to stitch some people up. And then they send this gentleman on his merry way along with the rest of the people in his caravan. Next, Quoth goes to visit a blacksmith to get himself a nice bit of wrought iron. Almost everybody in town has done this, so it's not very uncommon, but Quoth is anything but common. When he arrives back at his inn, he is presented by the local woodcarver or carpenter, or not entirely sure what he is, with the sword hanging board that he ordered, made of a special wood that's almost impossible to burn, impossibly heavy and dense, and practically as durable as iron. Quoth takes this board and hangs his very odd sword upon it, to which his apprentice asks him questions like, don't you think that's going to be a little bit suspicious? Maybe you don't want to hang that right out there where everybody can see. To which Quoth just says, nah dude, I'm good. We then cut back to Chronicler, who has been traveling and has hurt his ankle, but it doesn't really matter because he hasn't been able to find a horse and he's hurting all over. He's walking through the woods at night when he spots a bonfire. Deciding it would be nice to spend the night by a fire instead of, walking through the woods by himself in the dark, he approaches the fire and sees a man there. And there's a strange smell of burning hair and some other unpleasant things. And Chronicler is just about to leave when he's addressed by the man there. And it turns out the man is Quoth. And he tells Chronicler to come by the fire and grab something to defend himself with. Unfortunate for Chronicler, he got there just in time for Quoth to be luring and trying to finish off the rest of the spider demons that have infested the woods. Chronicler, being a woefully poor fighter, is basically just bait. He distracts one long enough to pass out while Quoth deals with the rest. Chronicler wakes up, fairly heavily bleeding and with a head wound, but still thankfully alive, and Quoth asks him for some help before Chronicler quickly passes back out. I get the feeling Chronicler's a bit of a layabout. After Quoth finishes dealing with the demons and burying them in the proper holes, he decides he's going to carry Chronicler back. Upon reaching the inn again, Bast helps him take the Chronicler to bed, then proceeds to patch up Quoth, who has several different ragged cuts all over his body. After some sharp words with his apprentice, who said you should have let me be there to help you out, they decide they're going to question Chronicler a little bit. Chronicler, it turns out, was looking for Quoth, and after a very tense standoff at the bar, Quoth agrees to allow, and I say allow, Chronicler to record his story, but there are some caveats. First of all, Chronicler will have to be there for 3 days to record the story. It must be written entirely verbatim. Chronicler says he's not going to have a problem with this, and so Quoth gives him a test of random garbled nonsense, which Chronicler quickly copies down in his own version of shorthand, which leads Quoth to his next requirement, that Chronicler has to teach Quoth his shorthand. This takes about an hour or two. I'm assuming this was so Quoth could make sure everything was written verbatim. How he picked up a whole new language, which is phonetic in nature and designed to work in such a way that the man who's recording it can record anything, even if he doesn't understand the words. I don't know, but apparently at some point Quoth learned an entire language in a day and a half without sleep. But Chronicler is very excited because apparently Quoth's story is going to include things like how he tricked a demon, how he killed an angel, and how he did all sorts of other things. We have multiple beginnings to the story because we jump a little bit back, then we jump all the way back to the beginning of the world, and then we jump to the beginning of Quoth's life, and then we jump to the beginning of Quoth's story. Yes, there are several false starts. Quoth, it turns out, was born to a traveling group of performers called the Rue, which his particular group seemed to be basically really well-behaved gypsies with morals. They are trying to perform in this small town, but the sheriff doesn't want them there. He's mentioned how several troops have come through in the past and have been nothing but a bother and got the people too excited. Well, after some convenient name-dropping of the local lord who has given them writ to perform in the area, the sheriff is convinced to just let them perform. Quoth is unhappy at how the sheriff treated his father, but his father's like, some people are assholes sometimes, you should just let it go. Quoth goes off to sulk a bit, where he runs across an arcanist basically being given the business by the sheriff and another gentleman that they weren't able to give the other performers. The arcanist basically scares them off with a combination of technology and magic, which Quoth sees. Quoth immediately decides that he's going to recruit this man into their troupe, and so his lessons under Ben begin. Now, Ben is an arcanist. That means that he has attended the academy, where he learned various things, including sympathy, which is not magic, but some kind of magical physics. And he gives Quoth several lessons in sympathy, as well as history and math and a few other things. It's after a few months of this that we learn about Quoth's father's song, because the new song is about the origin of the Chandrian. I'm not going to get into the details here because I'd like this review to be over sometime today, and it has already taken me my entire weekend to get through this book. The end of the conversation, however, is when Ben talks about how he believes that Quoth would do well at the academy and is hoping his parents will allow him to go. We skip a little forward in time, and Kvothe is trying to somehow cajole Ben into teaching him the name of the wind, which is actual magic, because in this universe, knowing the name of something can give you command over it, at least to a certain degree. After pulling what he thinks is a joke, he actually knocks the wind out of himself using what Ben has taught him, and is unable to draw any more breath. Ben has to call on the name of the wind to save the boy, and tells his parents that, oh no, this was just an act we were trying to put on. But some of the trust is shattered between the two, and the lessons on sympathy become much more tame. At least until Ben decides to leave the troop. Now, Ben leaves the troop because they come to a town where there is a rich widow who was the brewer's wife, and the brewer died. She takes a liking to Ben because 1, he's an arcanist, and 2, his specialty is in brewing. And Ben takes a liking to her because she's roundabouts his age, and she comes with lots of cash. Always something to smooth over a relationship, especially when you've been living on the road for a few years. It's during Ben's farewell party, which they go into in far more detail than I'm going to go into here, that Kvothe's father is convinced to sing a little of the song he's been writing, which he really just does the intro to, and then stops. Everybody's kind of disappointed, but they're like, hey, we're lucky we got this much, and moves on with their lives. At least for a short time, till one day when they make camp and Kvothe goes away, and everybody in the camp is killed by the Chandrian. Apparently, they don't like songs being written about them, and they came to make their displeasure known in person. Kvothe, being lucky to be away, comes back to camp and just sees the massive amount of slaughter. He starts walking towards his family campfire, and it turns out that the Chandrian are still there. He is almost immediately attacked by one of the Chandrian, who knocks him down and is about to kill him when the one sitting around the fire, whose face is in shadow, who goes by the name of Halifax, basically stops him trying to assert his dominance. Some strange arcane torture is gone through, and I don't mean like physical stuff, something magical happens, and then the Chandrian have to leave. Lucky Kvothe. Well, he's not entirely lucky. Everybody he's known and loved is dead except for one person who's too far away to reach. Kvothe, in his psychotic break, picks up some of his stuff from his father's cart, as well as his father's loot, the guitar, not the money, and heads off into the woods to basically sleep off an emotional hangover. Kvothe then spends several months by a stream just kind of camping out in the woods, playing his lute, learning to play different various things, until one of the strings break and then he learns to play with less strings, and he continues this process for several more months until he's down to 3 strings and winter's just around the corner, at which time he decides to head south. Eventually he's offered a ride by a nice farmer and his son into the largest city that Kvothe is heading towards. Kvothe is still traumatized, and though he's polite to the people around him, he's very, very closed off. The farmer, who parks in the city to sell his lumpy squash, offers Kvothe that if he can make it back by nightfall, they'll take him to the farm, they'll let him stay there as an extra pair of hands, and make sure he's fed. Kvothe, being a bit shocked, just goes off to see if he can't find some more lute strings for this lute, so he can continue playing it. Unfortunately, he doesn't get far, because he's mugged by a couple of local kids who basically try to steal his loot. Kvothe gets very, very angry because it's the last thing that he has to remember his father by. There's a fight, the lute is broken, he gets the crap kicked out of him by the local boys, to the point he's knocked unconscious. He wakes up with some random guy who thought he sounded like a girl, basically rooting through his pockets and stealing the last few things that he owns. Everything aside from some string, and the book that he was given by Ben. Then, broken, beaten, and basically distraught, tries to make his way back to the farmer, only to arrive to nobody there. And thus begins Kvothe's career as a beggar in this city. If you think we've covered quite a bit of the book, you would be wrong. This is a little less than 25% of the way in. Let's get to what I liked and disliked. So first of all, I want to start with a dislike. I really, really did not like the fact that we had several false starts to Kvothe's story. First, he goes to one of the exciting bits where he gets kicked out of the academy. Then he decides to cut back to the beginning of time. Then he skips all of that to talk about how he was born. And then he skips to when he was about 9 or 10 years old. And I'm not 100% on the age there. This was a very long book, but I remember that being a good 45 minutes I could have done without. Let's get into my biggest conflict here, and one of the biggest reasons why I'm mixing my likes and dislikes here. And that's going to be Kvothe himself. Now, A lot of people are probably going to be upset at how I pronounce his name because there's some subtle difference between how I'm pronouncing it and how it's supposed to actually be pronounced, and I'm going to level with you, I simply don't care. As far as I'm concerned, he's Kvothe. I'm going to make it easy on myself. I will not strain my tongue with any kind of complex character names. But a complex character name fits because Kvothe is kind of a complex character. First of all, we learn at the beginning of the book that he has many, many different names, and many different people know him by many different things and many different titles. I'm not going to get into them all here because there was a lot of them in the book, and taking notes on this book was rather difficult because you don't know what's going to be significant. Kvothe is equal parts famous and infamous for some of the stuff he's done, including tricking a demon, killing an angel, slaying a dragon, all sorts of weird stuff. Another problem I have with Kvothe is his selective sympathy, and I don't mean the pseudo-magic. When he's a beggar, he feels bad for kids that are lesser than him, which is understandable, but he cannot empathize with kids that are on his own level. Even when he runs into the beggars that assaulted him the first time, he doesn't understand, despite the fact that he's lived this life for several months, that maybe they were in a rough position as well. I'm not saying he needed to forgive them, but some of the behavior he has towards them is understandably childish. At the beginning of the story, at least in the beginning of Kvothe's story, we're informed how mature and unlike other children he is. Now, I'm under the impression that he's saying that I was like this because I had some kind of psychotic break. It made me behave more like other children, but it just doesn't feel quite as genuine as it should. And also, for someone so smart and someone who's supposed to be so wise, he doesn't seem to have the ability to turn his enemies into allies, which is kind of a prerequisite for being extremely wise. Also, he's a thief. He steals from people who he feels bad about stealing from, but since there's nothing he can do about it, and he's looking them in the eye, and he's already made a deal with them, he's just going to steal a little bit more. I get that he's in a bad situation at this point, but given his parentage and how his parents raised him, and how they raised him to be They tried to raise him to be a good, honest person. Even if they were a little bit deceptive, they tried to use their powers of theater and deception in a positive way, being good people, trying not to harm the people they're around. And his father was a powerful influence on him, but a lot of that doesn't seem to have carried over into Kvothe's character. And that's something I just really didn't like about him. He doesn't seem to be his parents' child selectively, but he has a lot of pride in his parents, which felt really odd. He doesn't seem to have the same moral quandaries that he should, given who his parents are. And I understand that hunger and desperation can change us a lot, but I'm still convinced that his morals are a bit too flexible. Next, let's talk about his attitude. And yes, a lot of my like and dislike is going to be about Kvothe. First of all, I like that he's pretty much got the attitude that he's going to survive no matter what. He's in this for him first and foremost. That makes him a compelling character, especially for one that's so smart and capable. However, he's also very close-lipped, and while I could understand this with some of the psychological trauma he's gone through, I'm not sure I like it or if I dislike it, because one of my biggest pet peeves with him is that he doesn't seem to have a problem with infidelity, but given his upbringing, he probably should. But it's mentioned a few times, especially in the present of the book, with his apprentice, who is a bit woman crazy, that he doesn't mind this guy going around basically playing around with the farmer's daughters and other people's wives. And given how his parents did their best, especially his father, to make sure that there weren't any homewreckers in his troop, I feel like this is something he should have a problem with. Also, as far as his attitude goes, he picks fights where a wiser man wouldn't. Now, he's supposed to be a fairly intelligent guy, but several times in the story, he picks fights where he could have easily made allies. There was one of the desperate boys who he breaks into his little hovel, burns all his personal belongings, and basically eats and drinks all his provisions. And then when the boy tries to seek some modicum of vengeance, he has the boy chase him down an alleyway, which he covers him in strong alcohol and sets him on fire. This is not somebody who would have empathy. He could have done so much to turn these kids to his side, and that would have not only shown great intelligence, but great wisdom. Now, granted, he's still a child, he would lack wisdom, but this is Kvothe. Kvothe is supposed to be kind of legendary. He's demonstrated before this point he's much smarter and wiser than even full-grown adults, but yet he's not displaying this here. And I'm going to attribute this to some kind of psychotic shock of losing his family, but I'm not sure I contribute all of it. Also, he's got the problem he can't let anything go. He always holds on to his grudges. But he seems so laissez-faire with letting other grudges be caused. Again, I reference my infidelity problem. And a lot of his attitude just keeps causing more trouble for himself and others. And I'm going to reference when he's actually in the academy and he's actively antagonizing a noble who people know and he is known for causing problems for other people. Despite the fact that this noble has done things like make sure he can't get a job and basically antagonize him at every turn, Kvothe decides it's going to be a good idea to write a song about the man, mocking him, which the man will know is obviously about him, which I'm going to refer to as Donkey Donkey. That's not the real name of the song. It has a much more coarse name, but I'm not going to say that for YouTube's sake. I believe I've already cursed in this video once. I want to try to at least not do it a second time. He's also quite irrational. He just does things with no regard to his situation. There's a point where he's supposed to go do his job the next day. Somebody who's desperately poor and has mentioned before he does not wish to go without food, decides to play hooky so he can run off to another town so that he can learn something about the Chandrian. This is not the thought process of somebody who's spent 3 years starving on the streets. I'm going to skip work, the thing that's making sure I have food, the very things I'm working towards, so that I can go follow a rumor. If Kvothe was a D&D character, I'd say he probably has a 1 in wisdom. But that leads me to the obvious problem with Kvothe, and that's that he's a Mary Sue. He's too smart, but that's actually covered. So it's discussed earlier in the books that there are people born with these natural talents, and it's explained through one of the members of Kvothe's troupe, who, no matter what he bets with dice, that number always comes up. Some people just have some almost magical, if not outright magical, gift that seems to follow them throughout their entire lives. In Kvothe's case, it seems to be that he learns things far too fast. But even that can't really forgive him from some of the Mary Sue-ish tendencies that he has. Many of the problems he has, most of them to do with money, are too conveniently solved, too quickly solved, and most of the time, they're not even really problems. He's also just a bit too good at everything. Now, he's not so good to the point that nothing poses a challenge, but he's still the top of the top at almost everything he does. He learns things far too fast. Now, I do like things about Kvothe. There are things about him I find enjoyable. But I think the hatred is that he's just close enough to being a relatable person to give you a sense of jealousy. He's like that person you knew growing up who was just a little bit better at everything, that no matter what you did or how hard you tried, they were always one step beyond, just a little bit better than you at everything you tried, for one reason or another. And I think that's one of the things that makes him an unlikable character. Even though he's poor, that's only a problem because he's spending all of his money in one area that he doesn't have any patience. And his lack of patience does make him far from perfect. He's not the perfect Mary Sue where he's oh so much stronger and oh so much better. He still gets hurt. He's just enough better to make him a Mary Sue. And that doesn't sync up with some of the stuff that comes up a little later in the book. And one of those things is that he's kind of a simp. Later in the book, it's revealed that there's this woman he really likes, and by reading the book, you can tell she really likes him too. But for some reason, he actually says that he's content with her going out with other men, with them hanging all over her and having fun with her. I'm not sure if it's the bedroom fun or not, because one day she's going to forget them and she'll always come back to him, and I'm sorry, my dude, that's some simpish behavior. And also, I'm just going to mention this right here because if everything else hasn't proven this, Kvothe is kind of a massive drama queen. He learned a lot from being an actor in his childhood, and he uses that to his advantage, but he also stirs up a lot of stuff, and he uses this to get the better of other people. And I really don't want to provide too many more examples here, and I don't want to stay on Kvothe all day, so let's move on to something that I did like. Well, liked and disliked. That's going to be the prose. Most people, and a lot of professional writers, will tell you they subscribe to the Hemingway method of writing. They try to keep things as minimal as possible. Tell the story to the bare minimum and let the imagination take over. This book is not like this. This book is like a long, winding, scenic road with trees and towns on both sides, and you're just being pulled along on a nice, leisurely ride just to look at what's going on. But that being said, it can be a bit too long-winded. The guy who wrote this really, really likes to paint a picture, and a lot of the time he does a really good job of it. And strangely enough, a lot of the time when the story is getting a little boring, it's the prose that carry it. A lot of these descriptions will carry you through, even at times when it's boring for a little longer than is actually comfortable. We've also got the problem that sometimes it's a little hard to tell what's going on and why it's going on. Furthermore, the prose are very purple. If you've heard the term purple prose, basically it means it's very flowery. It's very highbrow. And often it feels unnecessary. But the thing is, this was not a story written for brevity. At least it doesn't feel like a story written for brevity. If you were to strip the purple prose from this story, it would probably fit along with a lot of modern fiction where the main character was just too powerful and a bit too dull. But I think the really flowery presentation, the over-the-topness of it, is one of the things that really makes the story. And it leaves me with this weird feeling because I normally really like a story that gets right into the action, that gets right into the meat, that can hold my attention with suspense and politics. In-world politics, not real-world politics. Making that distinction right now. Like Game of Thrones has a lot of in-world politics, not our world politics. This book seems to be more of a folk telling. It feels like a folk story told by the person who lived it. Now let's touch a little bit on the world building, because there's a lot of cool stuff here. First of all, there's lots of demons and monsters, which I love. As a personal thing, I really like demons and monsters in my books because I think they add a lot of flavor. But it's not just that they're in the book, it's that they have a deep tie to the world and its history. When you read the book, you find out more about the Chandrian, and they are completely unremovable from the history of the world. They are part of the world. They're not some otherworldly entity that just kind of came in and now they're causing havoc. No, they are actually physically part of the world. Often their history is presented in an entertaining way because we only get little bits and pieces here and there from several different characters. Even if it is a little exposition heavy when we're given this, it's still entertaining. Which, if you've ever written a book, you know this is a very, very hard thing to do. But every little thing we learn and all the people feel like they're just part of something so much bigger. And one of the dislikes I have is that we meet a lot of named characters, and it made taking notes really hard because we didn't know if we were ever going to see them again. A lot of development is put into a lot of characters with names who you might see once or twice and then never ever again. They're just never brought up, just off into the dustbin of history with you. But also with the world building, the money is kind of weird. So first of all, there's region-specific money, but then there's money that's accepted everywhere, which is basically trade bars. And while it goes into a little bit of information as to how the money works, it's kind of convoluted and a little bit difficult to follow. And since money is one of Quoth's biggest problems, I feel like I would want to understand that a little bit better, because he lists the amounts of money that he has, and I know that it's explained it, but whenever he talks about how much he needs or how much his tuition is going to be for the next semester or how much debt he's in, it's difficult for me to follow because his money comes to him so easily, so often, and his money problems just kind of come in and go. While that does feel somewhat realistic, it's also fairly unrealistic. I have trouble having sympathy for him because the money comes into his life and just solves his problems. Something weird happens and he gets money. He wins a singing contest. They save a town from some fire-breathing monster. Every time he has money problems, you can almost guarantee there's going to be some kind of plot advancement, some kind of event that's going to lead to Quoth getting his hands on quite a bit of cash. Next, let's talk about names. Now, if you're familiar with fantasy at all, and the idea of knowing a demon's name giving you power over it is not a new concept, but in this world, knowing anything's name gives you power over it, such as the name of the book, the name of the wind. You also have like the name of iron, the name of fire, the name of stone, all sorts of other things mentioned, and it is actually a branch of magic called calling. And some people are better and some people are worse. It's something taught at the academy, but it's still kind of shrouded in mystery how one starts to learn this stuff. It's odd and nebulous, and I actually think that was one of the better parts of the book. But let's get away from the magic and talk more about the physics magic known as sympathy. Now, sympathy in this book really just is oddly applied physics. It's using things that are like each other in order to manipulate each other. So you can make two stones move, or you can pull heat from something and put it into something else. Voodoo dolls, things of that nature. It's interesting, but it feels more like physics than magic, and yet it's still magic. It's got a weird feeling between science and magic that's very reminiscent of what I used to see in the 90s in a lot of television shows and various other media that I enjoyed. And let's get a little bit onto the religious side, because I also want to cover the god in this, because the god, at least the god they worship, is very, very hardcore. He feels like something straight out of Warhammer 40k. So his story was that he was born through a woman, but he was always there. And he shows himself to all these villagers, and they think he's a demon. And he basically beats them with a smithing hammer and gives them a choice as to whether to follow him or not, promising them not, but that he'll be on their side if they walk on his side, and embracing those who choose his side and just beating down those that don't. Then he travels from town to town, repeating this process, casting out demons, chasing Infernus, the king of all demons, for, I think it was months, if not years. Eventually, he catches the king of the demons, and then he binds him to a giant iron wheel, and then tosses him into the fire of 1,000 fir trees. And the demon just kind of sits there screaming, almost dying, but the fire is so hot it starts to melt the chains. And so the god literally jumps onto this hot iron wheel to hold the demon in place to make sure that he dies. And the demon is screaming the whole time, but you're going to die too. To which the god responds that, well, I don't care because you're supposed to be punished. And we're going to see this punishment all the way through to the end. And I felt that was very, very, very hardcore. I did like that little bit of world building tremendously. And actually, the King of the Devils has one of the best lines I've ever heard, because when he's tied to this iron wheel, this god decides that he's going to question him, and he gives this demon a chance, like he gave everybody else. Come to my side, you'll have to deal with your punishment anyway. But if you come to my side, I'll offer you some forgiveness. And the devil tries to lie, and it causes him nothing but immense pain. And the god tells him, I told you not to lie while you're on that wheel. And so the devil decides to be truthful, and he says, if I had it all to do over again, all I would change was the speed I ran. And then he goes on to threaten everybody in the vicinity. This was shortly before he was tossed onto the giant bonfire and burned alive. But he's not the only demon in the story. Demons are a little bit of fun world building in this, where they can only be cast out or destroyed through 3 different means, and that's pure fire, pure iron, and the name of God. And while that is true, it's also not true. We get some information later on that this might not necessarily be the case, and what we think are demons might not always be demons, but they're like demons. There's a lot of weird things. And speaking of quotes, this book has a lot of really fun quotes, things that just made me stop and laugh, that felt really clever. I'm not going to mention them all here, but I will like to mention one more. And that was when Quoth was going into his academy interview, or for his admissions, I would say, because I believe that's what they called it. He basically makes this big proclamation that if they give him money, he'll be a student like they've never seen before. He'll learn things faster and greater than they've ever seen. One of the teachers comments on this that if he had more students like him, he would have to teach with a whip and a chair instead of a slate and chalk, and I thought that was a fantastic line. So much so that I decided to mention it at the end of a 30-minute rant. But unfortunate for you, this is not the end, because there's a few other things that make the world building more colorful, and that's some of these songs. The aforementioned Donkey Donkey, which he wrote to make fun of a noble he was quarreling with, and while I think this was a dumb idea, the fact that he had a line in there that said, I have a pizzle that's set to fizzle, made me laugh so hard I had to stop the book and go back a bit so that I could make sure I didn't miss anything. If Quoth was any class in D&D, he would certainly be the Bard class, especially with how overpowered it seems to be. Though less so in the blatant charisma, have children with everything that he finds way. And the last little bit of world building I want to mention, because it gave me some problems, was the time. I'm not sure if this is a thing in a lot of fantasy books. I'm glad we have some units that I can use, like days, but when we're getting into things like spans and the names of the months, and I'm not sure how many days are in a month, or how many months are in their years, it gets very confusing because it seems like at some points a semester is 2 months, but that would imply that if a semester is 2 months, that their year is 4 months long, which makes a lot of other odd questions. I'm not entirely sure how their time works. And the reason I didn't go through and tell you all the stuff that I did like and I didn't like is because a lot of it's a big murky mess. There are things in this that I like and dislike at the same time. There are things that I enjoyed and didn't enjoy at the same time, and that's going to lead me into my thoughts. Now, on the one hand, I'm not entirely sure where this series is going. As Quoth talks about some of the accomplishments that he's done, they're not all as grand as they first sounded at the beginning of the story. Now, I do have a pretty good idea where some of this is going because of the "it's always a woman" thing, where we got the woman he's trying to hook up with and Quoth is all depressed at the end. Pretty sure she dies or is taken or something horrible happens and Quoth is to blame. It's a very standard trope. It's not a bad trope. Tropes aren't a bad thing. If you want to put them in your books, if they make your story stronger, you go for it, you enjoy it. But on this note, I want to say that I enjoyed this book, but I will probably never read it or listen to it again. This is one of those stories that, at least for me, is one you go through once, you remember it, you enjoyed it, but you're probably not going to touch it again. It's like how I felt at the end of the Joker movie. I enjoyed it. It was something interesting. It was something different. I'd probably still give it 5 stars, but will I ever watch it again? No, I think the novelty in this was just seeing what would happen. I will probably pick up the next book at some undetermined point in the future, but I'm not sure that I'm going to listen to this particular book again. Partly because of how long-winded it can be, partly because of how flowery it is, but mostly because of how long it is. Further, this is probably the best example of how to handle a Mary Sue character, a character who's overpowered, and I'm a little bit trepidatious to say this. I would put this beside One Punch Man as a good example of what to do with a stupidly overpowered character. It's a fun story, it's entertaining, you don't just make it about their progress. Though I have a suspicion this is going to be a very, very hard series to close, as series with Mary Sues always are. But I would like to also say this again feels a lot like a folk tale, some kind of living legend being told by the person who lived it, who might be a little bit kinder to themselves at points, might be a little meaner to themselves at some points. But what Quoth is telling us is actually killing a lot of the legend that he's supposed to be living up to. Furthermore, on the it's always a woman trope. Again, it gives me a really good idea where this story is going to end up going. I have an idea of the ultimate end. I'm not sure if I would want to just call that foreshadowing. It is a trope I'm a little bit tired of, though it is entirely understandable, and I might be less tired of it by the time I finish this series. Also, the story, while it does have a basic structure, feels really random. If you would imagine a long overarching bridge, and occasionally there are legs jutting down underneath it to span the river, the waters that just swirl around these legs would be the bulk of the story, while the bridge is carrying us to where we need to go. It's a very difficult analogy, but basically we have unchangeable times that are just surrounded by swirling chaos. Things that needed to be hit, but everything around them just feels, if not tangential, completely superfluous. We're not entirely sure where it's going, but Quoth mentions in the beginning that all of this is going to come to a head. That's a mighty tall order because there's a lot of stuff that I feel needs to be tied up or that wasn't tied up to my satisfaction. And finally, I'd like to say, as a character or as a person, I don't think I'd like Quoth. He's kind of a psychopath. He often does things either purely for his own amusement or purely for his own advancement. He's not above making other people look like, well, a bit of a heel. He has no problem using his acting chops to fool everybody around him that he's a sincere person, and I have a problem with that. I've known too many people like that, and so much of his life is an act. He has trouble coming across as a genuine person, or at least someone who would be genuine with you. But those are just my thoughts. And with that being said, and with this being long enough, I will wish you all good luck. Thank you for listening to my review. If you have any books that you would like to hear my take on, please leave them in the description. I do tend to favor indie authors over conventionally published, but I will read whatever I find interesting or whatever captures my fancy. If you would like to read, review, or criticize my own works, I will include a link in the description. Also, please keep the comments civil in the comments section. Also, if you enjoy what I do, please consider giving this video a like, sharing my work, or subscribing to my channel. Thank you.